Easter! Do you know why the Easter egg hid? Because it was a little chicken. I never start with jokes. Okay, what's not a joke is that Easter is actually my favorite Sunday to preach. I do not identify as Christian, but I love a good story. And Easter is ripe for digging into. It's been interpreted and reinterpreted and fought over for 2,000 years, and I find that irresistible. For those of you who didn't grow up with the story or who left it behind and maybe are a little fuzzy on the details, here's a very, very short version with maybe some bias in it. Jesus of Nazareth, teacher, healer, rabble-rouser, friend of the outcasts, spent 3 years preaching a radical message of love, justice, and the nearness of God to absolutely everyone, especially those that the religious establishment had written off. This made him enormously popular with ordinary people and enormously threatening to the powerful. He was arrested, tried, and executed by crucifixion, which was the Roman Empire's preferred method of making an example of people who got too big for their britches. And then, on the third day, something happened. The tomb was empty. He was seen and talked with by Mary Magdalene first, and then by others. And these experiences transformed a small, frightened group of followers into people willing to risk everything. And it's safe to say that the world has not been the same since. That is the story that we're working with today. And specifically, I want to talk about what that story means at a theological level. Don't just fade out. Hang in there with me. Because how we understand the story theologically turns out to matter enormously. Okay, so let's say I'm at your house. We're sitting down, we're talking, we're drinking some tea. You may have noticed I tend to gesticulate when I speak. So we're talking and my arms are flying all over the place. I'm excited and I knock over your favorite lamp, which shatters. Of course I am apologetic. Oh my gosh, I am so sorry. And so now you have two options. You can either demand that I make restitution and pay you back for the lamp, or you can decide to forgive and forget. Among other things, in the Christian tradition, Easter is about forgiveness and reconciliation with God. It's about atonement. That is, how to put the relationship between God and humanity, to put right the relationship between God and humanity when humanity has sinned, has fallen short. There are many different atonement beliefs that look at how the life and death of Jesus allows or assists us in becoming reconciled or at one with God. And it's one of the latter theologies that I want to address today from which this lamp metaphor comes. This theological understanding is called penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA. After I break your lamp, if you decide to forgive and forget, PSA says you end up paying a cost. Either you do without the lamp, or you have to buy a new one. Now, imagine that you're God, and I have not broken the lamp, but I have sinned. PSA says that just as you as a lamp owner had to pay a cost if you decided to forgive and forget, then God too has to pay a cost when God forgives our sins. Now, in the lamp scenario, I would probably offer you money to buy a new lamp, right? But according to PSA, as sinners, we are not capable of making sufficient payment. That was a really expensive lamp. To rectify our sin problem. And not only that, but the only restitution that God will accept is not money, but death. Someone has to die. This theology looks at the cross in purely legal terms. You and I are criminals. We're sinners. God is a bloodthirsty judge and executioner, and Jesus becomes the one who steps in between us, letting the angry judge beat and kill him in our place. Having killed an innocent person, the judge is somehow satisfied, a little less angry, and sets the friends of the dead man free. Phew. I know a number of us came to Unitarian Universalism in direct reaction to our horror at this merciless, angry theology. Many former Christians have thrown out the baby with the bathwater when the water was tainted with this PSA theology. But believe it or not, PSA is actually a relatively new theology of atonement, and it's not what the Christians originally believed. Our history as both Unitarians and Universalists demonstrates that we have been in opposition to this problematic theology from the beginning. So, this PSA theory began to emerge approximately 1,000 years ago. Before this time, Christians didn't focus on the death of Jesus in the same way or interpret it as a kind of legal transaction. In researching their book, Saving Paradise, Rita Nakashima-Brock and Rebecca Parker found that images of the crucifixion were not prominently displayed in churches until the 10th century. Sit with that for a minute. Images of the crucifixion were not prominently displayed until 1,000 years after the death of Jesus. Instead, the early church focused on Jesus' teachings and the practices of the early Christian community affirmed life in this world as the place for salvation. Within their communities, Christians in the first millennium sought to help life flourish in the face of imperial power, violence, and death in the world that they lived in. It was in the 16th century, in the Reformed Church led by John Calvin, that PSA really blossomed. I feel like every time we hear the name John Calvin, we can just collectively boo, right? If you don't know the story, I invite you to look at the relationship between John Calvin and Michael Servetus, a Unitarian, because he had Servetus burned at the stake. So John Calvin, boo, very nice. So it was John Calvin that PSA really blossomed, and it's not too surprising that it has legalistic overtones. Reformers wanted to stress a just God over a merciful God at that time, right? Today, PSA is the dominant atonement theology for evangelicals, and its influences reaches far beyond the church walls. Benjamin Corey, an Anabaptist author writing for Sojourners, made the connection explicit. 5 centuries of understanding God's justice as the need to punish rather than the need to reconcile has given us a broken framework for justice in this country. We measure justice by whether someone has suffered sufficiently, not by whether anyone has been healed. And our overflowing prisons are the result. Think about this. A theology that says that sin must always be punished, that mercy without penalty is cosmically impossible, doesn't just shape how we think about God. It helps shape the moral imagination that we all swim in. It influences how we think about each other, how we understand harm, and what we believe justice requires. Now, it hasn't done this alone. History and power and economics all play their roles, but PSA has helped normalize a world where justice becomes punishment instead of healing and restoration. But PSA is not the final or only way to understand the Easter story. Far, far from it. An earlier atonement theory, one in which both the Universalists and the Unitarians have our roots, is called the moral influence view. It holds that the purpose and work of Jesus Christ was to bring positive moral change to humanity through his teachings, through the community he founded, and through the inspiring effects of his life and death and what came after. This is one of the oldest views in Christian theology. In the 16th century, as John Calvin was developing PSA, an Italian theologian named Fausto Sozzini was advocating for something very different. Socinianism, as Sozzini's, so fun to say, Socinianism, as Sozzini's theology was called, was an early form of Unitarianism. Sozzini rejected original sin. He rejected hell. He said Jesus was fully human and argued that Jesus' sacrifice serves to inspire us to abandon our sins, to choose a different path, not to satisfy some cosmic legal debt. And here is something I want you to sit with just for a moment, because I think this is where Easter stops being a specifically Christian story and becomes a more general human one. Many of us are not Christian, and yet many of us vibe with what Jesus actually said and did pretty well, right? Jesus was way cool. His message was not primarily about heaven or hell. It was about how to live now with radical love and with justice, with solidarity with the poor and the outcast. The cross in liberation theology is not primarily a transaction, like in PSA. It's a statement about who the empire crucifies. And the proclamation that the empire does not get the last word. You got that? The cross is not receipt. It's not a receipt, proof that a debt has been paid and the books are balanced. It's a mirror held up to power, to every system that has ever crushed the vulnerable to protect the comfortable. It shows us what these systems do, and the empty tomb then says, the cross is not the end of the story. You do not get the last word. You don't have to be Christian to find that profound. You just have to have lived long enough to know what it feels like when the powerful win, or it looks like the powerful are winning, and refuse to believe that their winning is the final word. Now, one of the great liberal preachers who carried a moral influence view of atonement was Hosea Ballou. We can cheer whenever we hear Hosea Ballou. Say, yay! There we go, excellent. A founder of American Universalism. Ballou, very nice, was raised in a strict Calvinist Baptist home, but he could not reconcile a belief in a loving, all-powerful God with the idea of eternal punishment. And so he searched and he found the theology of universal salvation. In 1805, Ballou published his Treatise on Atonement. Ballou wrote that orthodoxy saw humanity's punishment for its infinite sins as separation from an angry God, while universalism saw people struggling to turn toward moral good, away from sins that separated them from a loving God. You catch that difference? Ballou contended that Christ's death released a great spirit of love into the world, making those who were receptive to it better able to atone for their own sins and be reconciled, not to a God appeased by death, but humanity awakened by love. What Ballou did was reimagine the entire relationship between humanity and the divine. Not a God who needs to be satisfied, but a God who is always reaching towards us, and a love powerful enough to actually change us. And he went further still. This atoning spirit of love was available not only to Christians, but to all people, irrespective of names, denominations, peoples, or kingdoms. No sin was so great that a loving God would condemn anyone to eternal punishment. Salvation was universal. Ballou, yay, detested PSA. In his treatise, he wrote that a false education had convinced thousands that God's law required endless misery to be inflicted on the sinner. Instead, he saw God as a nurturing parent who loves us unconditionally. He believed there was nothing in heaven or earth that could do away with sin except love. And that love was stronger than death, stronger than any moral failing, strong enough to reconcile all of humanity with the divine. We see a direct line from Ballou's theology to our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, not the inherent sinfulness. Not inherent debt, inherent worth. These days, Unitarian Universalists have a sometimes complicated relationship with Easter. We love hope and rebirth. We connect it to spring and renewal. We like the bunnies and the egg hunts, like what's going to happen later. But talk about the cross, and some of us tend to get a little squirmy. And I think the reason why is because PSA has hijacked the story. It has become, in many circles, the loudest, if not the only version of what Easter means. And so we recoil from the whole thing, not wanting to accidentally endorse a theology of divine punishment and cosmic blood debt. But the cross is, at its heart, a liberatory symbol. It says this is what the empire does to those who preach love and justice and who threaten the powerful. And it says, and this is not the end. The early church did not center the death. They centered what came after, not as a legal transaction, but as possibility, as life breaking through. Our faith tradition offers the world something it desperately needs right now: an understanding of Easter that is inspirational rather than punitive, that understands Jesus' final act, forgiveness of his executioners, love in the face of state violence, as something we can aspire to, not a transaction we passively receive. And if Easter is about restoration rather than punishment, then the question becomes, what does that look like in real life today? And that brings me to something that you are doing in just a moment: the commissioning of your new Healthy Congregations team. Now, I know some of you have complicated feelings about this team. Maybe you've heard the term right relationship and your stomach has tightened a little bit. Maybe you've imagined something like a church jury, a committee that gets to decide who gets voted off the island. That fear makes complete sense because we live in a PSA world. We have been formed by a culture, legal, theological, and social, that understands that accountability means punishment. Someone does something wrong, and someone then must suffer the consequences. Justice is penalty. We don't see justice as restoration. But that's not what this team is about. And it's not what our tradition as Unitarian Universalists is about. The Healthy Congregations team exists because we believe, as Hosea Ballou believed, as the early church believed, as liberation theologians today believe, that the goal of justice is wholeness, not punishment. When conflict arises in a community like this one, the question is not who must pay. The question is, how do we restore relationship? This is restorative justice. Most of us have very little framework for it because we've been swimming in the waters of punitive justice for our whole lives. And so it feels unfamiliar. It can even feel soft, like no one's really being held accountable. But in fact, restorative justice is much, much more difficult than punitive justice. Punishment lets everyone off the hook. The punished person suffers, the debt is paid, no one actually has to change. No one actually has to change. Restoration requires everyone to stay in the room, to tell their stories, to listen to the stories of others, and to be open to being transformed by what we hear. That is the lofty goal of the kind of community we strive to build. Not one without conflict, that doesn't exist, but one where conflict becomes an invitation to grow rather than a cause for exile. So when you commission this team in just a moment, I hope you will see it not as the installation of a church court, but as a concrete expression of what it means to be a community that chooses love and restoration over punishment. A community that believes in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, even the ones that we are in conflict with. A community that is, in its own small way, trying to love the hell out of the world. This, beloveds, this is what Easter means to me. As a Unitarian Universalist who loves this story without needing to claim it as my own. It's not a story of debt and divine punishment, but instead is a story about what happens when love refuses to stay dead. When a community refuses to let empire have the last word. Resurrection happens in communities like this one when we choose restoration over punishment, wholeness over exile, and love over fear. Every time we do that, something dead comes back to life. Every time we do that, it is Easter. May it be so. May we, together, make it so.